do this. John 12, verse 39. For this reason they could not believe, because, as Isaiah says elsewhere, blobbity blobbity. And then I wrote, this does not justify well at all what God did, in response to their footnote, which read, could not believe, does not mean the people in question had no choice. In fact, that's actually totally what it means, because the writers of the NT, the New Testament, were deterministic. There is no evidence for free will anywhere in the New Testament or in the Old Testament. They purposely rejected God and chose evil, and verse 40 explains that God in turn brought them a judicial blinding of eyes and hardening of hearts. Yet many Jewish leaders did believe in Jesus as Messiah. So they're contradicting themselves in their own footnote. John 13, verse 16, I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. And then I wrote, that would mean we are the master of Jesus, which is a contradiction. John 14, verse 15, if you love me, you will obey what I command. And then I wrote, that allows that you do not have to do it and like it. So in other words, you can do something and not like it and still be obedient and loving Christ. But elsewhere we see that no, you actually have to, you're forced to love someone, which is really creepy and Stockholmy. Chapter 14, verse 12. He will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father, and I will do blah blah blah. Which contradicts that no one is greater than Jesus. But does allow someone to do greater things than Jesus. Just another pointless verse. John 15, verse 16, yet again proving the determinism of the New Testament. It says, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit. Which means that, and then I wrote, this means that he chose for Judas to betray him. 15, verse 24, if I had not done among them what no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. And then I wrote, this contradicts the command not to cause another to sin. John 13, verse 13, he will not speak on his own, he will only speak what he hears, and he will tell you what is yet to come. So then I wrote, this backs up speaking only by quoting the Bible. You're just not allowed to have any thoughts that aren't pre-written ahead of time by someone else. Acts 1, verse 26, then they cast lots, and then I wrote, doesn't the Bible exclude casting lots? So apparently not. Apparently we didn't work through the entire New Testament as a part of this course. But I'm also seeing that they had us read a ridiculous amount of stuff as part of this course. It's like, it's no wonder fall 2003 was difficult. It's just cramming way too much material in way too short of a time. With the poor backing of all of it, you know, in terms of the reason why we should study it. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 46. The spiritual did not come first, but the natural, and after that the spiritual. And I wrote, what about God? You know, I mean, that would be nice if that was the message of the Bible, that spirituality didn't come until way after natural stuff. But, you know, it'd be too much to ask for them to be consistent. And on that same note, verse 53, for the perishable must clothe itself in the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. And I wrote, are we obligated to find the cure for mortality? Does this mean that we will have scars? But it would be too much for, you know, to ask that they come up with a actual useful thing like finding ways to prolong people's lives. Instead, we're focused on all this ephemeral stuff. 2 Corinthians verse 21. What anyone else dares to boast about, I am speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast about. If I must boast, this is verse 30, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weaknesses. Following from this argument, only a fool would boast of his weaknesses. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 10, for when I am weak, then I am strong. This contradicts what he says about Christ being strong. The more weaknesses you have, the more sin you have. So this contradicts the fact that Jesus is stronger than a weak person. I also wrote, in other words, he's glorifying his sin in front of others by saying that he's weak. Since sin is falsity, it would contradict saying that it is the truth. That note isn't fully fleshed out. Oh well, nothing is... Oh, actually. Also, a person who is weaker intellectually and is easier to... Also, a person who is weaker intellectually and has an easier will to manipulate, Jesus prefers and is stronger because they are narrow-minded and propose less of a challenge to God's omniscience. So in other words, he wants useful idiots, which we have seen plenty of. Galatians 5, verse 10, the one who is throwing you into confusion will pay the penalty, whoever he may be. And I wrote, this likely refers to one who is challenging your faith, questioning God's principles. Christians can also confuse something, though. Verse 11, in that case, the offense of the cross has been abolished. And I wrote, does this imply that Jesus abolished the law? No. Galatians 5, verse 13. But do not use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature, rather serve one another in love. Then I wrote, Jesus did not abolish the law. He just added more laws to it so that we would have to obey him more and like doing it. Then they ban factions in verse 19. And I wrote, illogical. Different people want different things from others. They did not give me a Bible that allows for much writing in the margins. It's like, this is all I've got. Dissensions and factions are to be banned, which defends the view of a one-world Christian state. Selfish ambition, which defends not pursuing a secular career. Galatians 6, verse 4, each one should test his own actions, then he can take pride in himself. And I wrote, this is the basis for testing the Bible's logic. But past Joey, what the Bible is really saying is test his own actions, not test the Bible. So you're not allowed to test how illogical the Bible is. Because apparently it's totally free from any lapses in logic. Chapter 6, verse 2, carry each other's burdens. And I wrote, explains why many Christians, especially parents, are typically so intense towards others' problems whom they are close to. In other words, trying to make other people's problems their own. Chapter 5, verse 16 through 18. So I say, live by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the sinful nature. For the sinful nature desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the sinful nature. They are in conflict with each other, so that you do not do what you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under law. And then I wrote, means that God has to have us liking it as well. So you're not allowed to do sin and like doing it and want to do it. It's just typical thought police type stuff. And I wrote, humans are by nature sinful. We are told not to go completely counter to human nature, which would make us by nature as uncomfortable and unhappy as possible. The acts of sinful nature are obvious, and I wrote, this contradicts the fact that if they were, then the holy people of all cultures would all have the same Bible, and they don't. I mean, you don't even have the same Bible within, like a church. You've got dissenters within the same organization, let alone, globally. Ephesians 3, verse 20, now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. And I wrote, within the law. So, you got someone who's limited by a whole bunch of bureaucracy and ritualism and legalism and stuff. Ephesians 4, verse 17, you must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. And I wrote, you can't choose both technology and Christ. It's just, you have to be a backwards, uncivilized person in order to be a Christian. You cannot be a modern thinking person exercising thought that lies outside of the scriptures. Ephesians 4, verse 29. Do not let unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, and every form of malice. And I wrote, this refers to slander and cursing others, but says nothing about curse words or dirty words. Um, 5 verse 4, nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. And I wrote, we have no definition of what is coarse, so we have to assume that the only thoughts we are allowed to have are those mentioned in the Bible and those of thanksgiving. So you're not free to think anything that's outside of this. And I mean anything. So there's stuff that's out of place, which would be comedy. And I wrote, thus, comedy is a sin. I also wrote, anything outside of the Bible is a gross perversion. The essence of comedy is incongruity and foolishness. What is consciously wrong, incongruity is what is out of place, and thus is wrong. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, and along with every form of malice. And then I wrote, which is why Christians are perceived by others as behaving like reformed criminals. I don't know what that has to do with anything. Maybe it's a different verse. Oh, here. Let no one deceive you with empty words. And then I wrote, fiction is a sin. Um, 5 verse 11. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. In other words, I wrote, we are not allowed to compromise secularity and Christianity. 5 verse 29. After all, no one has ever hated his own body. And then I wrote, this has been contradicted many times. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. This is coming from chapter 6, verse 1. Obey only parents that are in the Lord. That are in the Lord. Honor your father and mother. And I wrote, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy a long life on the earth. Our definition of honor and what is going well differs from the Bible. A long life with parents commanding the entirety of it would be undesirable. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord by following the Old Testament. So they will have to decide for themselves what is right. No, so they will not have to decide for themselves what is right. Ooh, that was close. We almost had individual deciding what was right for themselves. Verse 5, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. And then I wrote, masters become godlike figures. Verse 9, there is no favoritism with him. And then I wrote, contradicted many times in the Bible by Noah, Adam, Abraham, Joseph, John the Apostle, and more. Then I wrote, the favoritism here is probably neutrality towards slave and master. In other words, God not preferring slave and master. Philippians talking about the effect of Paul being in, I think it's Paul, being in chains for the masses, and I wrote, or in verse 18 it writes, or it says, "But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this I rejoice." And then I wrote, God cares more about the masses than the individuals, which is reflected a gajillion times elsewhere.